I am Robert Joe. I've been in Korea for 19 years, but I grew up in America before that. I was born in New York, and I spent the majority of my formative years in Texas. I originally was born in New York, but I spent 2 years there, so I have no memories. And then I spent 2 to 4 in Korea. So my first memories are actually of being in Korea. And my first language was technically Korean. But then I moved to Texas at the age of 4 and assimilated super fast. And so I actually lost my Korean language, even though I was in ESL when I first moved to America, and then had to rediscover it later on. I actually took 2 years of Korean language classes here and discovered where all my holes were. Like, I don't know if this happens a lot for other Korean Americans, but you get into this comfort with a certain level of spoken language, and then you realize you don't even know the most basic grammar, and you're stuck in this weird mix of talking like a child and also knowing random like high vocab words if you learn them in school in like a college setting. My family moved over to America in the 70s, so we were part of that professional migration that happened in the 70s. My father at the time worked for Samsung. I believe it was steel and trade. They had a home base in New York. And so my father in the 70s moved over, and that's where my brother was born. That's where I was born. And we became, this immigrant family in New York and Flushing, which I later realized was this whole Korean enclave. And then we went back. We did kind of I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the migration patterns of having these jobs. People that are moved over, it's like 2 years and then they'll bring you back and then they'll send you over. So we went New York, back to Seoul, and then Houston. Around the time I was in 3rd grade, my dad was called back to Samsung, back to Seoul. And he decided that he wanted us to grow up in America. And so he did something that was, I think, unthinkable for extremely Korean salaryman. And he quit this like cush, safe job at Samsung. And he tried to set out to do his own thing just so that we could stay in America and grow up as Americans. I think the idea of what I wanted to be when I was growing up, when I was younger, it was always somewhat vague, especially now when I look back on it. Obviously very informed by some assumption that my parents' desires would be reflected in some way or fashion. Just, the whole like, you're going to be a lawyer or a doctor. Like, I don't think there's anything, that question is almost pointless because as an Asian American, as a Korean American, your parents wanted you to be a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. I was personally drawn to art. I thought of myself as this very creative person. I thought of myself as this good artist. I was one of the better drawers in early years until I got frustrated when I realized other people were much better than me. And like many other things in my life, I was not willing to do the work to get better. I just wanted to be naturally better at everything that I did. But I didn't realize that always requires an investment in time and money, which if your parents force you to do it and you're forced to get better, then obviously that would be helpful. But at the time, my parents weren't forcing me to get better at art. Although my mom supported my art interests as she was a hobby painter. She was a hobby oil painter. So I probably got that sensibility from my mom. And so she sent me to art classes up until the point where after a while, she's like, okay, that was enough. Go study more. My mom was a huge, she was the most important person in my life. I definitely see myself as my mom's son. My personality was a lot more like my mom's personality. She was more artistic. She was quieter, more sensitive. My father was, a bit brasher. And my brother very much took after him. And so there was a very clear distinction between like the sort of like dad and my brother and me and my mom dynamic. At the same time, I was really lucky, like my mom would actually say that it was a good thing that I got the best from my dad and the best from my mom and somehow managed to avoid the majority of the faults of both. Obviously, I think my mom was being a little optimistic about that. My mom was very much like the sensitive person who paid attention to other people and really helped. You know, she was considerate. She had great nunchi. She never really learned English that great. But, you know, smartest person in our family. I would say my mom was a huge part of who I am as a person. I mean, the hardest moment in my life was my mother passing away, which was 2020. So it was very recent. It was extremely difficult. It was cancer. It was pancreatic cancer, which is an aggressive and really ruthless form of cancer. I was kind of her primary caretaker, kind of not. You know, my brother moved here from America to help take care of her. My father was there, but my father's had health problems for the last 3 or 4 years. He's not fully there. I wasn't living with them, but I drove my mom back and forth from the hospital, you know. When she was in the hospital, I was there, you know. My brother and I would switch out, maybe it'd be like a week of me and then a week of him or something. It was a very Korean experience. It was a Korean hospital, you know. There's nursing staff, but a guardian is expected to be there. It was very frustrating, very enraging. The limits of my Korean became very clear. Trying to discuss chemo treatment and, you know, medical strategy with an extremely dismissive doctor who, you know, in a system which is I'm so thankful for so many ways, but also it's like 10 minutes with my mom, this doctor who's not noticing that, or doesn't seem to care that she can't eat. She's like starving to death. Like, these are difficult things to have. And the experience for me was a lot of anger, but also a lot of anger like internally. Like, why do I not know the system better? Like, why is my Korean not better? Why can I not look up on the internet like dietary information for my mom to save her life? You know, things like that. By the end of high school, I got into, you know, a decent school. I got into Berkeley, and then I didn't even go there because I realized, oh, we're actually also not as rich as all these people who, now that I look back on it, were the sons of doctors or the daughters of doctors and engineers and lawyers. And even though my parents were professionals and they made money, we were still actually quite working class. Like, we were actually a working immigrant family. I didn't realize. But luckily, by the time I was finishing up high school, I kind of had a sense, oh, I want to do film. I want to do film. It'll be creative. It'll be artistic. My parents were pretty realistic about things. You know, they weren't like trying to beat us into, you know, pursuing engineering or whatnot. And so when I got into, you know, our state school, UT, I got into some honors program there, and I knew they had a pretty solid film program, and it was pretty cheap. I got a fair amount of scholarship money to, you know, go to UT, and I knew it wouldn't cost my parents that much. And honestly, I think my parents realized, like, hey, we don't really have the money to send you to Berkeley for 4 years. And so when I thought about it, like, what do I really enjoy doing? Like, I enjoy this collaborative creative process of making videos or films. And when I think about really tough emotional moments where I was super depressed, you know, a good movie could break that, like, you know, like better than, you know, drugs. When I came to Korea in 2002, I had pretty much zero expectations. I knew I would watch some World Cup stuff. I figured it'd be cool to reconnect with cousins. I had so few expectations. In fact, I was positive it would just be a very small trip and I would leave soon. But I just had so much fun. I came to Korea and my cousins were all around my age. They were all heavy drinkers and partiers. It was a World Cup. Biggest fucking party on earth. Korea was having this Cinderella run. Country that had never, I think, even scored a goal in the World Cup up until that point was finally going, you know, all the way to the semifinals. We were out in droves at City Hall, you know, just crying, just bawling when we won, like against Spain or against, I think, Portugal. It was just like every single game was a fucking miracle. I was surrounded by like hundreds of thousands of people, all dressed in red. It was it was mind-blowing. And I was like, it's kind of fun here. Maybe I'll stick around. I've been in Korea for so long. I've seen so many changes and seen so many abrupt changes compared to, say, the rest of the world, that I'm very hopeful about Korea as a country with a future. And I say this because growing up in America when you're younger, the sort of assumption that America is always going to be the best. It's going to be the best country with the best jobs and the best opportunities and the best intentions at heart is a given. And I think even until relatively recently, I always assumed I'd go back to America and work, or I'd get some job opportunities elsewhere, or maybe I'll move to Europe, or whatever. And I think I always had like half my eye abroad. And I witnessed changes here that are very good, very broad, very fast. And I see the limitations. I've been in Korea long enough to see the limitations. I haven't obsessed about my position in Korea vis-a-vis what Koreans think of me, because I don't think that's important. The longer I've spent in Korea, the clearer it is that I'm not important here, and I shouldn't be. And obsessing about the ways you should be perceived or whatnot are an extremely Western form of entitlement, I think. It's natural to, as a person moving through a society, to be egotistical and to view things through your lens. But the longer I've been here, oddly enough, the less I feel like Korea owes me anything. And the more I have to question, what do I have to offer Korea? I think I was early on somewhat distanced from this super Korean-ness of an experience. So I grew up naturally Korean American because I am Korean American. And I had brushes with these very distinctly Korean American like tropes, cliches. I'm hard pressed to put a label on it. And because I was in a very, I guess, white area, there was definitely a fair amount of like pretty typical, identity struggles. Like, I'm different. I'm not. I have all these friends. It's kind of multiracial, but it's kind of not. It's also super white. I know I'm not these white people. I don't think my story of Korean American identity was all that different from other people, but I was shielded from an imposed, like, preformed Korean American identity that was formed by a lot of other groups. And I was obviously not just white, football, cheerleader, all that stuff. And so somewhere in the middle, I grew up until the point where now I'm like, well, luckily your identity is just whatever you end up as. And so, especially from an artist perspective now, I distinctly reject this sort of over-obsession with identity. I feel like in the creative process, it can be extremely limiting. I think it's by definition imposed upon you by others. And even though obviously it's important for a lot of fun things, and it's important for motivation sometimes, and it's important to be aware of identity and to process identity and deal with identity, I reject the idea that we have to be obsessed with identity. I hope down the road that the idea of Korean Americanness and these sorts of stories are like a fun novelty. Like, that's cute. But for it not to be this gut-wrenching battle that people are having in their lives. I'm very happy that I've reached a sort of peace with my identity. I really want more people to reach that peace. I really want a lot of discussions in America amongst Asian Americans, Korean Americans to center more about things past these very, I hate to dismiss it, these very like rudimentary, like first step feelings and struggles about identity. Not that they're not important, but that there are so many other, I think, important battles and issues and struggles that we all need to take part in. I hope that everyone who sees this in the future are like, oh yeah, remember when Korean Americans were just a little too concerned about who they were? That would be my hope. My name is Robert Jo, and this is my Korean American story.